Go
And
for
I
it.
can tell you one of which I was involved in. I used to stay with her, and she lived in a trailer, and um, the front door was right by one of the bedrooms, and we were laying in bed one morning on a Sunday talking, and we heard three loud, distinct knocks on the door. And I jumped up and looked out the window, which was right above the bed, and there was nobody out there.
Ooh.
And she starts laughing, and she goes, "You don't realize that that was on the door. That wasn't the screen door. That came from the inside." And then it dawned on me she was right.
You mean the knocking was not from outside? It was inside the trailer that you heard the knocking.
Yes.
Ooh.
Yeah.
So
But the trailer she lived in, she said was haunted, which I could sense a spirit there as well. She said his name was Charlie, but how she knew that, I don't know. So,
well, maybe the spirit communicated with your grandmother.
very good possibility.
Now, was she the only owner of the trailer? I mean, was she renting it, or did she own it, or was it previous owned where maybe somebody passed on named Charlie?
Nope, she was the only one that lived there. She's the first person that lived in that trailer.
Well, then again, was it in the trailer park or out in, on private property?
Well, she thought that the spirit followed her from the house she lived in previous.
Well, that's a possibility. Sometimes, where you like there's people, that have a brand new house, Lori, and then they get worried because all of a sudden, doors open and close, the refrigerator opens and closes, and there's nobody in the kitchen or nobody's upstairs where the bedroom door opens and closes. But, some of the time, it could be from the previous, whatever was there before that house was built or that mobile home or trailer was, parked on it. I mean, you don't know what was there and what happened on that property. Or, depending on what could be even buried under it. Because, I remember my grandmother and grandpa. They lived up, a few miles from where, my parents lived up in a place called White Center, that's near Seattle area. And they had this like one little bedroom house they were renting, and they were in it for a year. And, they would hear weird things at night, and finally after about a year living there, and then they were retired, older people. But, if they say they heard something, I guarantee they heard something. It got to the point where, things were being moved around, jewelry was missing, and nobody was breaking in or stealing it. Things were moving around in their little house. And they decided they weren't going to, renew the lease, and they went somewhere else. After they moved out, it was like in the newspapers and on the news that the next person that went in there, had to go down underneath the house, and they did something for the plumbing. I can't remember what it was. I was a little kid. But what they did is they found a blanket with chains around it, and one of the previous tenants murdered his wife, wrapped her up in a blanket, and she was underneath the, floorboards and underneath the front room.
Wow.
So I got a funny feeling that, there was, spirits roaming around, and that's why they were hearing these noises and things were being moved around. I think maybe there was a spirit there. It was not, easy. I guess being murdered and being thrown underneath the house is not a good way to, be planted, I guess.
Yeah. Well, sounded like they were trying to get somebody's attention.
Well, yeah. Well, they certainly got my grandmother. I mean, my grandmother would come over to our house, like every Friday, to watch TV and stuff. They were always so upset, and my grandfather, he served as an MP during World War II and then over in Europe and, fought and all that stuff. And he was unglued a lot of times because, he'd be sitting there reading books, about World War II, naturally. And, he would hear banging and all that stuff going on in the house. And, well, I guess maybe, I never found out what happened after they found the body, if that, went away or not.
Yeah. Would be interesting to find out.
Yeah, that's, so, that's one thing, being a dispatcher. I mean, you must have heard some real, from police officers, some real interesting stories, didn't you? Of things that maybe have happened and stuff like that?
Well, one story, and this was, let's see, it would have been either the late 80s or the early 90s. There were two officers working. We were on midnight shift, and they were sitting just at the north edge of town. One cruiser was facing north, and the other one was facing south, and they were just sitting there talking. It was pretty quiet, and they both had their radar on. When the one that was facing north, his radar went off, and it showed something coming towards him at in excess of 100 miles an hour. And immediately after that, it stopped, and the one facing south went off doing the same thing. But they never saw anything.
Well, maybe it was a different dimension, and time, slip or time warp. I don't know. I mean, there's interesting things that happen, Lori, all the time, and you can't. How can you explain it if you don't see it? I mean, just weird things go on. I would find it very strange, even back then with the electronics of radar, that, one would go off and, face in one direction, and then all of a sudden it would go off the other direction. So something was going on and playing with them or something. Right.
Well, and here's another thing. They weren't sitting too far from a graveyard.
Ooh.
So who knows if that was involved,
That could be doing that. Somebody maybe, that ended their life from a wreck or whatever, from high speed. So, maybe they're out, as a ghost still driving. I don't know. It's things, in the paranormal and things like, you got to have an open mind because there's no way to explain stuff. I mean, the whole paranormal field, 99% of it, it's really hard to explain it.
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
So what got you, Lori, into writing, were you writing before you retired or after you retired? What got you into it?
Actually, I have been writing my entire life. I belong to this one group on Facebook, and they, on Wednesdays, they want you to post ghost stories, fiction or nonfiction. And I would just put stuff down that I wrote. Well, the lady that owned the site told me that I needed to seriously consider putting my stories together and make a book. So that's kind of what started the actual publishing, and then I found out where I could self-publish, and it just kind of went from there.
Oh,
and
wow.
Now I have 12 books with 2 more in the works. So
now, how long have you been since you actually been self-publishing, how long has that been going on for?
About 1.5 years now.
Wow, I got a good friend, Liz, that she's a retired, she was a paramedic, and then she was a sheriff's deputy till she got injured for quite a few years. And she just wrote a series of, I believe, 5 books that she self-published. And, I got a couple of them here. And, I really like, I guess maybe it's because I'm a paranormal freak. But, she wrote some really good books. I like stories. And she writes some, basically next to a military base or at a military base, these creatures somehow got out that they were, doing experiments with. And it was kind of good read, good between sci-fi and humor and suspense. Are you books are that way too?
Yeah, I actually I've written like all different kinds of ghost stories. My bestseller is a book called An Angel Named Jenny, and it basically is kind of a light paranormal story. But it's about a young girl who is abused physically and mentally by her mother, and her father finds out. And without giving too much away, anyhow, the father takes her and they move away. And she, as she's growing up, she discovers that she has special gifts, and she can use these gifts to help those who, not only those who have passed on, but those who are close to passing on. And so anyhow, that's my bestseller so far, but it follows her from her being young, very young, to after she passes away.
What's the name of the book, Lori?
And then An Angel Named Jenny.
Now, where can people find that?
All of my books are available on Amazon, and they're available as either Kindle version or paperback. And actually, I have two Great Danes, and my boy Sergeant is actually a character in this story.
Oh, wow. So, and question, are you married or single?
I am married, yes.
Okay. Have you worked your husband into any of these stories yet without him knowing about it?
No, he doesn't believe in the paranormal. So as far as that, we're kind of at the opposite end. But he's never read any of my stuff either, so.
Huh.
But.
Well, maybe he should. You know, a lot of people sit there, you know, and they say, the paranormal isn't real. Paranormal isn't real. You know, I've seen some things, you know, at one point, you know, I've been in radio since 76, not 1776, but 1976. I know I'm old, but I'm not quite that old yet. But I took a break for 16 years out of broadcasting and got a job, you know, managing, because one of my things, I was a professional photographer, you know, and I had clients like Leonard Nimoy and stuff like that. But, you know, how can I say it? I took this job as a general manager of 3 camera stores, professional camera stores, in the Tacoma, you know, Seattle area. And the main store was in Tacoma, downtown Tacoma. The building was built around the 1870s, and it originally had like 12 or 13 stories. It was a hotel. But, you know, back in the late 60s, they deemed the building not safe, so they took off, I think, like six or seven of the stories off of it. But going into this, okay, here I had all these employees that would come and go. Some of them were like, former military, like ex-Rangers. I even had a former SEAL. I had a guy who was a chief bosun mate on nuclear submarines. I mean, all dependable, you think, people. And, of course, this is over a 16-year period because camera salesmen come and go. But we had a basement, and I didn't really know much about the building. You know, I didn't really care. You know, I just did my job. But my employees, we had our stock for all 3 stores in their basement because it was huge. And they would come up and tell me, they'd say, "Hey, Gary, this place is haunted." And I started looking at them like, "Hey, you're nuts, you know?" They would tell me weird things would move, or they have weird smells, and or weird things would happen. And, you know, I'd start thinking, well, gee, somebody started this rumor going around, and it seems to hang on from employee to employee. Being the boss, Lori, I never had to go down in that basement very often. In fact, very rarely would I ever have to go down there. And at one point, I had a group of like 3 salesmen that refused to go in the basement. They just absolutely, I could have fired them. You know, that's how much they refuse to go down there. I went